Hey class, we are now in Unit 8. In this unit, we still have a reading assignment, and a short homework assignment. So I want you to read Chapter 3, pages 79 through 79 through 79 through 83. And so it's a short reading, and it's gonna kind of do a little bit of kind of meta logic and showing you how a method for justification for the truth tables. You're not gonna have to really do any work related to that, but it'll be helpful to read that over based on what you have done and seeing how they're justified, some kind of meta logical analysis of that. And we do have a homework assignment. It's exercise 313. It's just exercises over the entire chapter, more kind of application, thought, kind of thought-provoking questions to help you think about these things a little more conceptually rather than rote memory of working out, truth tables or providing definitions or memorizing definitions of things. So an example is like this, number 8. It says, suppose you know that a particular argument is deductively valid and has a false conclusion. What, if anything, can you tell from this about its premises? So just working to give an answer in that, as short as you want it, as long as you want it, and do that in electronic form in a document, and submit that document within the unit by midnight on Sunday. And so that's the homework. I want to also do a little more application, thinking through how some of this applies in what we do in ministry, what we do in the church, what we do in the Christian life. And in many ways, it applies in some theological context, some philosophy of religion context, and helping us to kind of clarify our thought on things that we know from God's revelation of Himself to us, but also in apologetics as well. You see logic show up quite a bit in good apologetics, and for Christians, the most important question is not whether or not some gods exist, but of some sort, but whether or not the biblical God exists. And so, the Bible is not primarily concerned with to demonstrate that some sort of God exists, but to explicate exactly what sort of God exists. That's the revelation of God to us and how one can know that God. And so, the arguments that people give in apologetics for God's existence are not necessarily fundamental to one's experience of God. One can still know God and love God, and know Christ and love Christ without knowing these demonstrations for God's existence. And so, but they are valuable. These arguments are valuable. The arguments that apologists give, and especially those that use deductive reasoning, and in order to kind of clarify the argument so that we're able to share and defend the faith in a persuasive way that people can grasp in a clear way. And so, these arguments, the value of arguments for God are that they're rational in character. And so, many of life's most important decisions are not based merely on rational reflection. So we want to acknowledge that, but some are. And, the arguments that are given in apologetics are subject to a couple different, interpretations usually, and they can't point, conclusively they draw people into, as Greg Kokel says, that it puts a stone in their shoe to believing and trusting in Christ and believing that God exists, and so they can kind of put a stone in someone's shoe that bothers them as they're wrestling with these arguments for God's existence, especially when they're rational, meaning they're using rational argumentation and logic to communicate. And so we argue for, people argue for God's existence. Apologists argue for God's existence because, it can help for the Christian to know the different arguments and know why they're rational. That's why it's important to learn logic, is because they can reinforce a Christian's belief, one's own belief in God, and therefore knowing that it's rational to believe that God exists, and they can help remove obstacles to faith, whether one's own faith that they're wrestling with, and they're being exposed to arguments, the different arguments for the existence of God, and they're clear and persuasively and rationally presented to them, but also in the presenting of the truth, it can remove obstacles to the people that are hearing, the obstacles they may have to faith, and so it can present and create a sense of crisis in one's investigating the Christian gospel. And so, that's why we think apologetics is important to our faith, to the Christian faith, and for evangelism and sharing our faith with others. And so we want those, the way we communicate and the structure of our arguments to be logical. And the way that logic is applied in these settings is seen in a couple different ways, just to get to a couple different examples. One way you can really see it very clearly is in the moral law arguments for God's existence, the moral arguments for God's existence. Many times, at least how it's been put recently by philosophers like William Lane Craig, it's put in a modus tollens kind of structure. So it's put in a logical, a valid form in order to show that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. And so moral arguments argue for God's existence from the objectivity of moral values and duties. And so a simple moral argument for God's existence can be, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. So if God does not exist, premise one, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. Premise two, objective moral values and duties do exist. Premise three, therefore God exists. And so the form of the argument that is presented here by William Lane Craig in his Christian Apologetics book is your standard modus tollens form of argument. It's a negation of the consequent to draw out the negation of the antecedent of the conditional that's in the first premise. So when it says, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist, it says objective moral values and duties do exist. That is to say, it's not the case that objective moral values and duties do not exist. That's to negate that consequent of that conditional. And therefore, via modus tollens, you negate the antecedent, which is to say it is not the case that God does not exist, which is to say that God exists. And so it uses a very well-known form, logical form called modus tollens that we'll talk about in the next unit when we begin to memorize these the logical forms as we seek to do proofs. And so logic has direct implications in our arguments for the existence of God. Even someone like Peter Kreeft, in his argument from desire, uses syllogism like William Lane Craig did in arguing for, in his moral argument for God's existence. Even in Peter Kreeft has taken an argument from desire and put it in a syllogistic form that is valid, that is arguing for from desire to the existence of God. And so he puts it like this in his argument from desire: every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. But there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, no creature can satisfy. Therefore, which that's showing us introducing a conclusion, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy that desire. And so it's not directly evident what is clear-cut as the moral argument that is in a modus tollens form, but this is a valid argument that we could symbolize and show that if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows. And so what you'll see someone like William Lane Craig do and someone like Peter Kreeft do is, what you do is, once you have constructed the argument in a syllogistic form of premise 1, premise 2, premise 3, conclusion, or premise 1, premise 2, conclusion is your number 3. There in that it's valid, you've established that it's valid or assumed that it's valid, and then you don't have to always go and prove that it's valid, but hopefully you are arguing in a valid way. So it's in a syllogistic form, and what they do is methodically walk through each premise of whether it's more likely the case that the premise is true or if it's false. And so you're arguing then about the truth and the content of the actual premises. And once you do that, you establish the truth of the premises, and if it's valid, then the conclusion follows necessarily if it's valid. So that's a way you can see in some of these arguments that apologists use for the existence of God, they're using logic in order to argue for the existence of God, because they're trying to communicate clearly, and that's the role of the syllogism. They're trying to communicate rationally. That's the role of its validity. And they're trying to communicate persuasively and show that it's sound. And that's kind of a broader role of philosophy and theology and history and persuasion about the truth or falsity of particular premises. But they're all using logic, so we can see the way logic is applied in an apologetic setting in order to clarify thought and remove barriers to belief, strengthen one's own belief in God, and like Kokel says, put a stone in the shoe of someone that's maybe investigating the Christian faith in order to create a crisis in their life that they would turn and know that God exists and turn to Christ as Savior. So logic is key in that, whether we're communicating verbally, on the street or in a conversation, or whether we're communicating in writing, through correspondence with someone we love, or through email, or possibly in an article or of that nature, or if we're communicating while we're preaching, that it's clear that there's a rational and logical flow to the order of our argumentation, so that if it's valid and we're arguing validly, which means to say we're arguing rationally, is that the premises support the conclusion that we're drawing. And if it's valid, it necessarily leads to the truth. The premises necessarily lead to the truth of the conclusion that we're arguing for. And so you'll see this regularly, like I said, in different apologetics settings, from William Lane Craig to Peter Kreeft to C.S. Lewis to more cosmological arguments of Aquinas and his arguments for God's existence from contingency and causality. And so someone like Aquinas, when talking about his argument from motion or change, which is a cosmological argument, his premise one is all mutables bring us back to a first mutable. Premise two, the universe is mutable. It exhibits characteristic change. Premise three, therefore, there is an immutable cause of the universe, and this we call God. So all mutables bring us back to a first immutable. The universe is immutable, therefore there is an immutable cause of the universe. And so logically, it's logically valid that a syllogism, so that if the premises are true, the conclusion necessarily follows. So what someone like Aquinas will do, and apologists will do, like I said, will then go then argue for the truth of the particular premises one by one. So all mutables bring us back to a first immutable. The universe is immutable. And he'll give different reasons why it is the case that all mutables bring us back to a first immutable. Maybe the impossibility of an actual infinite, the scenario of the infinite regress, and the possibility of the infinite regress. And then premise two, he's arguing the universe is mutable, and he's going to argue from experience and argue from motion and seeing things in motion and seeing things change, that the universe is mutable as well. And then the conclusion is drawn from those two first premises. Therefore, there's an immutable cause of the universe as being the universe being a mutable thing that must have a first immutable cause for its existence. And so that's another example that you see of valid argumentation being used to argue for the existence of God. His argument from causation, he says, premise one, no effect or efficient cause can exist in and of itself. It must have its own cause. Two, an infinite regress of efficient causes is impossible. Therefore, there must be a first or necessary cause, and this we call God. So first premise, no effect or efficient cause can exist in and of itself. It must have its own cause for its being, and an infinite regress of efficient causes is impossible, because you have to get to a point where there is the last cause in that series is the effect of a uncaused cause, and that is what we call God. So he's arguing in a logically rigorous and valid way to reach a conclusion, and then walking through the truth of each premise and showing that, okay, the argument is valid, we know from the laws of logic and reason, and then if the premises are true and it's valid, it leads to this conclusion necessarily that there must be a first or necessary cause, and this we call God. So you see people like Aquinas, who's the kind of a par excellence example of one who uses logic to argue for for the existence of God and the use of logic in apologetics. So you have everyone from William Lane Craig and the moral argument, Peter Kreeft and his desire argument, Aquinas and his 5 ways and his arguments from causation or contingency or motion, and so logic is important to know so that you can be able to argue in the same way persuasively, using simple logical forms and syllogisms to make your case. Sometimes they may get more complex. Usually you won't see that. They'll be very simple to make their point and be persuasive, like Aquinas' argument from contingency, when he says, if contingent beings exist, then there must be a necessary being. Contingent beings exist, therefore there is a necessary being, and this we call God. This is standard modus ponens, law of logic. The actual form of the syllogism is in a law of logic. If A, then B, A, therefore B. And so if contingent beings exist, then there must be a necessary being. Contingent beings evidently exist, therefore there is a necessary being, and this we call God. And so you then walk through and argue for the truth of the particular premises to reach the conclusion of the valid argument. So we see it just repeatedly in apologetics. And so it's helpful. That's why this course is helpful, because it is going to help clarify for us what valid reasoning is and what it looks like, and how to do it well, and how to analyze and evaluate arguments for that, and therefore also for us to be able to use valid argumentation in our own presentation of the truth that we hold. And so it's very helpful, and I pray that this class for you will be that as you're grinding through truth tables, as we get into proofs and you're grinding through proofs, that you'll know that there is application to this as you go, and as you present the gospel, as you encounter skeptics, as you have your own questions, as you go and read philosophers perhaps, or go and read apologists, you'll be able to understand them better, understand what they're doing when they put things in they put arguments in syllogistic form, and you'll be able to go, wow, I got clearer thinking on this, and I'm able to argue and think in a clearer way about the nature of God and who God is, and how I can communicate that truth to people. So I hope y'all will continue to press on through these homework assignments, through these readings in philosophy, knowing that there's application for this in one realm, apologetics, and as we'll see towards the end of the course, and in some deeper theological avenues and venues as well. So y'all be blessed, and like always, if you have anything you need to ask me about, feel free to contact me, and I'd love to help you in any way I can. And know your exercises are due by the end of this unit on Sunday night by midnight, so make sure you get those in. Exercises 313 on page 82, and we'll get those graded and get them back to you. Y'all have a good day.